Welcome to Brutally Honest Talk Radio, where you will learn about an issue minus the BS. We don't always say what you want to hear, but what you need to hear about the issues of the day. Here's your host, Inger, along with Elmo, with his political insight and commentary.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us tonight. I am Elmo. She is Inger, and this is Brutally Honest Talk Radio. And we have special guests on the show tonight, Dr. Randall Bock. This is a special and interesting show. And at this time, I'm going to let him tell you a little bit about himself and what we're going to talk about tonight. Thank you for being with us, Randall.
Thank you, both of you. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
So this is a real honor. I appreciate people who are taking on ideas. I've listened to some of your shows, and they're excellent. I actually was listening to The Comedian just the other day, and it's a funny world where comedy has to be not funny in order to be presented. Somewhat taking away the whole essence of comedy. It's a release, you know, and if we can't laugh at ourselves, I think we're going to have trouble. I was at my nephew's bar mitzvah over the weekend, and you know, nothing really went. I mean, there were plans, but nothing really went according to plan. And there's an old, well, it's a Jewish saying, you know, man plans and God laughs.
Right.
You know, we make our plans, and sometimes they don't all come quite to fruition. Along the way, you know, we have to keep vigilant. At any rate, I'm not here to expound. I am here to present some theories that I've come up with that kind of are really, I suppose, in a way, revolutionary about the Zika virus. And so, just to backtrack a little bit, I'm a medical doctor. I have worked in primary care medicine for longer than I want to think about. I had my 45th medical reunion.
Wow.
Excuse me, my 45th college reunion, my 40th medical reunion. So I graduated in 1981, and we had our reunion delayed a year because of COVID. So I just had the 40th medical reunion, and I've been in practice, you know, off and on for more than 30 years. So I ran my own medical office, and I've, you know, personally never seen a case of Zika. I never treated microcephaly. I've never been to Brazil, and you know, lo and behold, I have a book. Well, I don't know if we're doing video, but here it is. It's not quite in focus. I apologize, but I guess everything's supposed to be blurred unless it's my face. But it's overturning Zika, the pandemic that never was. And this book is on Amazon. And I have an article in the American Journal of Medicine investigating the Zika microcephaly crash. So I can talk a little bit about what that is, if you like. You know, COVID-19 has, you know, like a big cloud obscured a lot of what happened before. And, you know, we spent a couple of years not even learning, you know, being in school. So it's hard to learn history. Some of us remember it. But Zika microcephaly was a big deal at the time. It was 2015, 2016. It really kind of hit the news 2016. That's the year of Brexit, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump election. There were a lot of items in the news. The biggest medical item worldwide, the number 5, I think, story in general worldwide that year was Zika microcephaly. So what is that? Well, Zika, I went to medical school and I stayed awake for most of it. and I had to. I was doing the audio visual at least one of those years. And so I was awake for every slide and I attended every lecture. And not everyone did, mind you, but you know, they're all MDs now. Anyway, and I never heard of Zika. And so I was a little bit kind of taken aback when I heard of this Zika microcephaly pandemic. I mean, I heard of microcephaly, that just means small head. That's not really a diagnosis. That's a categorization, like a small person. You know, a small person could either be, you know, what we used to call a midget or a dwarf, and there might be a lot of reasons for it, but that's still just not a diagnosis. Anyway, microcephaly just means small head at birth. And it could be a problem. It could mean you have small parents or you're a premature baby or any number of things. Anyway, so I looked it up at the time and I saw that Zika was essentially there are 4 dengues. Dengue virus is a bone break fever, and that's been in Brazil for decades, maybe centuries, and originated in Africa. It either came over with the slave trade or sometime thereafter. because people didn't really know about viruses till the 20th century, so nobody really knows how long it's been there. But it causes 1 million cases every year of bone break fever, and there are 4 variants of dengue. And Zika, if it had a different name, would be really dengue 5. It's almost the identical virus. They share about 65% of their genome, and they're probably closer. Well, they're similar, probably as close as Omicron is to coronavirus.
Okay.
Another topic.
Okay.
But they're in the same ballpark, and they're more closely related probably than any of the other 2 viruses you can name. And dengue had never caused any microcephaly through the decades. Nobody had ever noticed this, and so it just was a curiosity to me. And I just thought, I was skeptical, because I wake up skeptical, I go to bed skeptical, I'm skeptical all day about a lot of things. Zika microcephaly happened, and I was puzzled about it back at the time in 2016. I had other things to do, and I forgot about it. But I posted a couple things on Facebook that I was skeptical that it was a thing, and then forgot about it. And then 3 years later, Facebook has a little kind of memory prod, and it showed up. This is one of the things you said back then. And I say a lot of stuff, and I was like, oh, I kind of looked it up, and I had the luxury of 3 years having passed like that, essentially, not for them, but for me. And I started researching, well, what did happen? And I had thought it was a flash in the pan. I didn't think it was real at the time, because dengue never caused microcephaly. Why should Zika do it? And lo and behold, it hadn't. Even in Brazil, in northeast Brazil, where supposedly that had been the epicenter of the problem, it had completely disappeared. And so I started doing research, and I came up with a piece that I thought would be useful for, regular newspapers and so forth, and like 800 words, not big, like an op-ed piece. And it didn't get published. I put it out to a lot of newspapers and so forth. Nobody really wanted to know about Zika anymore. And this is before COVID. This is the year before, in 2019. Anyway, so I kind of promoted it a little bit here and there. And I wound up having a phone call with the 2 chief editors of the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is the number 1 or 2 journal in the United States or the world, depending how you look at it. And early 2020, I was in a Zoom call. I sent a letter to Dr. Livingston, who was the chief medical editor, and I wound up on a Zoom call with him and Dr. Howard Bauschner, who were the 2 top editors at the time. And Livingston was interested in my piece. He thought it was indisputable that it had disappeared, and he thought I had a very good explanation why, and it would be a good commentary piece at the very least. And I was thrilled about that, because I'm just a regular kind of molecule in the bigger picture of medical doctors, and this would be a feather in my cap, whatnot. And so, so in the phone call, he said, we would really love to publish this, and we would publish this, but you knew the but was coming.
Of course.
But for the fact that there's this thing, COVID-19, and we don't want to sow any doubt in the public health establishment. And I'm like, well, I said, I'm sure I wasn't this witty, but I said, I thought you were a science and medical journal. I thought you were interested in science and medicine. And how are you supposed to be weighing whether people are telling the truth or not unless you present the science?
Right.
And I think it is your job to sow doubt in any kind of pronouncement, such as it's made. And mind you, and so he says, well, people in the United States, we have to listen to, the WHO and the CDC and Dr. Fauci. We don't want to people to doubt their word. I said, well, I'm okay with that. But if they say something that's not correct, it gives more veracity to show that they tell the truth the other times if you challenge them when they don't. Right? There's a solidarity between the people who control what gets said and the people who say things. And that's not the way I was kind of brought up. I think that, open debate is the best way to an answer. And I've been wrong probably as often as I'm right. But, the way to guide yourself over time is to hear contrary opinions and to come up with facts. Anyway, so that's enough of the preface. So I wound up, researching. The more I researched, the more kind of errors I found in the original proposition that Zika caused microcephaly. And so it wound up being this book, which again, I think might be blurry unless it's my face. I don't know how to get this. I got to go turn the blur off, but it's Overturning
Zika. Mosquito on the cover. Right?
Yeah, there you go. And it's on Amazon right now. I'm looking for people to buy it, to read it, to review it. And so that's for any of your listeners. I'd certainly be willing to engage with people if they have ideas about that.
Gotcha. Let me make sure I understood you correctly. So Zika, how does one get Zika? You said it's through a mosquito. Is it a bite? Is it like malaria? Kind of how?
Right. Well, it's similar in that sense to malaria. It's called an arbovirus, which means arthropod, which mosquito, insect, arthropod-borne virus. So there are a bunch of those, like West Nile, there's yellow fever, there's dengue, there's Zika. There are a whole bunch of others ones. Could hepatitis C potentially, but it's not by mosquitoes. Excuse me, I take that back. Hepatitis C is a flavivirus like Zika, but it's not borne by mosquitoes. So the ones West Nile, this yellow fever and so forth. Those are the major ones. Okay. And then dengue and now Zika. So it's borne by a mosquito, and that's its own illness. Now in Brazil, they actually didn't have any Zika testing when they declared that Zika existed in Brazil. Zika, insofar as it had ever been noticed, was first noticed in Uganda in Africa in 1947 in the Zika forest, and was presumed to be a monkey virus because humans didn't have any problems with it at all. And nobody ever really bothered with it again because it never caused a single human illness. And between 1947 and 2007, 60 years, there were a total of maybe a couple, 2 or 3, 5 articles that ever even mentioned Zika at all. So there was no literature on Zika at all. Wow. And in 2007, somebody near the Philippines, Yap Island, YAP, thought there was dengue outbreak. They sent specimens to the CDC, and months later, the CDC somehow cross-tested with Zika and thought it was in fact Zika. And they didn't have any illness. They had a little bit of illness. They had a couple of cases of Guillain-Barré, which is a non-specific kind of paralysis you can get after any number of viral infections, including the flu and so forth. But at a distance in time and space, the CDC said, "Oh, that's Zika," which is a variant kind of dengue. I think that's actually probably a stretch, but they said it. So once 2007 came along, it was kind of on the map, the mental map of a lot of people in the epidemiologic and infectious disease world, because this was a new word. Yap was a new word probably too, in Zika. And so they started talking. There was a little bit of, if you look at Google Trends, there was a tiny little bit of chatter about that, but it was enough to pique the interest of some intrepid doctors in the northeast of Brazil.
And correct me if I'm wrong, did you say that there were 1 million cases or a certain annual number of cases
of dengue? And year after year, for the last 40, 50 years at least in Brazil, there have been 1 million cases of dengue, which is Zika's twin. And all through those 1 million cases a year, and probably millions more exposures without actual illness, there was never any rise in microcephaly. So my point about the 1 million cases is there had always been a lot of dengue without microcephaly. And then in the Zika year, 2015, they had no testing for Zika. Somebody announced there was Zika. There were no tests because Zika had never caused any human illness. And they said Zika was there. They don't know how many cases there were. And then later on that year, somebody noticed separately that there were some more microcephaly cases in a town called Recife, northeast Brazil, big city. And then somebody else connected one new thing with the other new thing and called it Zika microcephaly.
Now, you said that the biggest symptom of this, or the biggest problem with it, is a baby or a person is born with a small head, or smaller than, in proportion the size that it should be.
Right. Well, the presumption, I'm just going to stipulate that there was Zika microcephaly. I don't necessarily buy into that. But under the presumption of the panic, it was thought that mosquitoes could bring Zika. And if it's first trimester pregnancy, it would bring about a lack of development of the baby's skull, and presumably the brain as well, because classic microcephaly, which is a genetic disorder, about 1 in 10,000 births worldwide forever, have been true microcephaly, which is a very small head, and the babies don't really thrive. They probably don't live, past a year or so.
Wow. That's a lot.
And that's a very sad, tragic case. But the other ones are just gradations. That's there was a lot of confusion about what was and was not microcephaly. In Brazil at the time, they had no real standard, and they were using a standard based on the Gaussian statistical curve, where about 2% of if you're in the 2 percentile, you were automatically microcephalic. Now that could mean almost anything. It could mean your parents were small. It could mean you were a premature baby. It could mean there was some drug use or toxins or whatever, and it might not even be a firm diagnosis of intellectual, capacity later on. So, in classic microcephaly, there's a very small head and there's very little intellect, and so the baby's not going to be, going to school and passing his grades, and so forth normally.
What's the life expectancy? Because
from classic,
you said some of them don't even live very long.
Well, again, in the case of Zika microcephaly, there was really a big cloud over what and was not microcephaly, because the world uses a different standard. The world standard was like, if you just look at the distribution, if you look at height, most people are around a normal height. There's some giants, there's some tiny people. So Brazil was using a cutoff of about 2% on the low end, and the world standard is about 17 times lower, about I think 15 times lower than that, so like a 0.3%. But again, it's only a statistical thing. They're saying these babies with really small heads, they're not likely to do as well intellectually, and that's often the case, mind you. But in Brazil's case, it just kind of came on all of a sudden. People got very worried and dismayed over it, and then a lot of doctors wanted to hedge and err on the side of caution. So a lot of normalish babies were called microcephaly. And this is before they kind of had the output to figure out what was and was not microcephaly.
Gotcha. And you said Zika microencephaly, it was, for lack of a better term, a thing around 2019, but this was right at the front end of COVID, and you were being advised to kind of put Zika on the back burner.
Well, yeah, the dates are a little bit off. The Zika microcephaly occurred in Brazil in 2015.
Okay.
It was 2016. It made the news, and it became a big uproar. There was there were warnings not to travel to Brazil. There was a warning within Latin America not to have babies anymore.
Oh, wow.
The health ministers in various countries and states within Brazil, various countries outside, like in El Salvador, Jamaica, a lot of the states within Brazil, their health ministers told women to stop having babies completely until we could, you might have heard this before, until we could have a vaccine. And so they were told to wait until a vaccine occurred before they would, carry on with their lives. They'd still be waiting because there's still no Zika vaccine. But that was 2015. I only got on the ball in 2019 because I saw a notice by myself, kind of a letter, like a letter in a bottle, washed ashore via Facebook, that I had said something about it, and I had this perspective of 3 years, of not thinking about it, to look back, and it was then that I saw that there really had not been any Zika microcephaly around the world, and once they developed a test for Zika, they started testing babies in other places, in Colombia, and they wound up testing people in Malaysia, India. A lot of places on Earth, they have tested for Zika, tropical countries, and even the United States and so forth. But in none of those places where they did actually see positive testing for Zika, which, mind you, could be confused with dengue, but in none of those places did they ever see any blip, any increase in microcephaly. Yes. A lot of times they're ignoring the blowback from what I say, I know he can misuse this word, but overkill of their message. If their message is too powerful and not really validated, they oftentimes can do more harm than good.
And that matches up with what you were saying earlier about the Journal of the American Medical Association. Sounds like, and I'm likely paraphrasing, but the folks who have the say can control what and who is hearing or what's being said and that sort of thing. And you were saying you were trying to get the people to understand, no, let's put the information out here. Let's debate the information. Don't hold it back and then put out a message. Let's debate the information so we can come to some sort of consensus. And that sounds like, this is what you were trying to do here.
Yes.
With JAMA.
That is exactly right.
Wow.
And a good scientist should want to get to the truth. And if he is corrected or someone brings something to his attention, then I feel like everyone should be on the same team in that respect.
Absolutely.
And almost thank the other person.
Absolutely.
Good. You caught something that I didn't catch.
I've been not a good athlete, but I've been a part-time athlete playing tennis and squash and golf and whatnot. And when I get a lesson, I know I'm doing stuff wrong. It's like I wouldn't take a lesson and just say, "Oh, you're fine," because how can you possibly improve anything unless you hear what you're doing wrong?
Right.
And it's not just for sports, but I think it goes across the board. It's why we have ostensibly why we have schools, why we have parents, why we have peer review, why we have institutions and so forth. I mean, if there's a message that gets to be a proclamation and comes from up high, I mean, that's okay if you're running a monarchy, or maybe if you're operating within the auspices of a church or something like that. Maybe that's the way things work. I don't know, but even there, I think there's probably a lot more debate than we have been allowing ourselves to have within certain contexts of public health.
Let me ask you a couple more questions about this. I don't know if this is Zika, but you mentioned the bone break fever.
That's dengue.
I mean, okay. Like, does that mean somebody is susceptible to their bones breaking very easily?
No,
or
it just
what
means
actually
it's kind of a chilling fever that you're shaking and whatnot. I have never had dengue. I treating people up in Boston. I've never not treated people with dengue either. But people survive it. It's a survivable virus that you don't want to have. It's better than malaria because it doesn't last long periods of time.
Okay.
But it probably has some initial symptoms to malaria, which is it has similar kind of chilling, chattering, horrible fevers and whatnot. But dengue is temporary. It lasts a few days to a couple of weeks, and then it's gone. And
Thank God.
Yeah.
And then another question I had was, if someone were to be bitten by the mosquito carrying this, there was an adult, is a grown person at risk at all, or is it just an unborn child or a baby?
Well, that's the thing. So Zika, still, I don't think they've ever really found that does much in the way of symptoms. Insofar as it might, I mean, it probably does it in certain primates, other primates, monkeys and whatnot. But for as far as humans go, Zika has never really been associated with a constellation of symptoms. But insofar as it might, it's mild dengue, they say. So if you take dengue, rattling fevers and turn it down, maybe it's like a mild cold or something like that. That's Zika alone. But that's harmless. The problem would be only if you were first trimester pregnant and got the Zika then.
Okay.
But even so, as we've seen later on, the cases in places where they have found Zika, they have not found any microcephaly increase. Now, again, when I say microcephaly increase, there's always been cases of microcephaly, from the ancient times and before until now. There's no way of getting rid of all congenital abnormalities, and so those things happen. But as far as an increase in it, no, there's been none with Zika ever since, and there probably wasn't that year as well. It was a mischaracterization. There was a leap. It was a conjecture that turned into scientific fact far too quickly for its own good.
With that, and also with COVID and everything that's going on with that, the CDC and a lot of medical institutions have had their reputations dinged, and folks don't believe them as much because of what's happened with COVID. So, how can what you're telling them and hopefully them listening, can any of that translate to help them improve their reputations? Because right now, a lot of folks don't trust the CDC, they don't trust Fauci, there's a lot of that going on. So I find that damaging to the medical community as a whole, because folks aren't going to listen.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right.
So what kind of lessons can you take to them from what you've been going through?
Well, I'm not sure how to fully answer that question, except that I think it's important that we always examine and look at, we're blessed as a country in many, many ways. We're blessed by the people we have and the history and so forth. And we've been not blessed in other ways. But one of the blessings we maintain is that we have 50 individual states. Yes. And the United States of America was originally founded as the United States. I think the real message would be that we have to be true to ourselves. I mean, I actually like certain versions of Dr. Fauci. The 2004 version of Dr. Fauci, I was listening to the other day, and I actually have it on, I have a web page, a Facebook group called Viral Conversation, if you want to meander over to it.
What's causing that?
But in 2004, Dr. Fauci said, there's no way I would ever give a vaccine to somebody who had the flu. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Something to that effect. So in 2004, I think they were talking about H1N1, which was a big deal at the time, and they had a vaccine for it, and they wanted everyone to get the
Right.
vaccine, but they had a certain amount of the vaccine. He says, it's really important if you have not had the illness to get the vaccine. But if you've had the illness, there is no better immunity than having the illness. That is full natural immunity. A vaccine can only give you a tiny fraction of that immunity.
Exactly. Exactly.
And so that guy I like. I think that's awesome. I think Dr. Fauci is spot on. But how can you lose that in the interim? That's a form of either mental corruption, financial corruption, physical decrepitude or something like that. That you cannot. And if any of those are the case, he shouldn't be leading. If it's age, whatever, he can't find his old tape from 2004. I'd be happy to produce it for him. But the fact of the matter is, he's absolutely right, and he's been absolutely right about a lot of other stuff, but oftentimes absolutely wrong.
Yes.
I think early on in HIV, he said that it's going to spread through heterosexual sex, and you're liable to get it from kind of incidental contact and so forth. There are political motivations for what people say when they say it. I think at the time that when he said that for the vaccine, they had a shortage of vaccine. They didn't want to give out a lot of vaccine. What he says now is they want to sell the vaccine. So he's saying, that people neglect when they say public health, they think it's just one thing, but it's actually, there's health part, but public is from the root word is the same word as politics, the publius in Latin. It led to the word politics, led to the word police, public, and so forth. Those are all the same word. That's has to do with the social function of how we all group together as a people, which is actually the same root word. And so we're saying public health, it has a political aspect to it, and you're dealing with populations. It's a very different thing to be a doctor, a doctor one-on-one with a patient, and the only thing that should be considered is that patient.
Yeah.
When somebody's in public health, they're trying to think about bigger things, and I think they go astray by losing some of the foundational aspects. So from 2004, Dr. Fauci, with whom I really agree, to 2022 Fauci, who says completely the opposite thing. So they lose credibility, and they act, as if they are monarchical, as if they are kings and queens, and that is not a place we should ever be. That's what
Let me remind people also about Fauci. In early 2020, he was saying you don't need a mask if you don't have symptoms, for the same reason that you said about there being scarcity of a vaccine.
Yeah.
Because he was worried that there weren't enough masks.
Yeah.
Well, it's better to say that than to say you don't need a mask if you're not having symptoms.
No, I know. Just be honest about it. It's like I think people can deal. We're thinking about putting a unit up as an Airbnb, and my wife worries because it's a basement unit and they'll hear us walking. I said, well, okay, fine. But so I looked through Airbnb locally, our neighborhood, and there's a unit very similar to ours. And she puts in as a disclaimer, you might hear us walking during the day, but at night we're going to be super careful. And everybody responds, I love the unit. She was absolutely right. I heard people didn't bother me because I knew it was going to happen. Like if you buy into it right from the get-go, I don't think it's an issue. So if you say what your problems are, you give a disclaimer. I think people are all good with that for the most part. And I think this is a problem that they cannot not back down. They can never retrace their steps and try to reformulate. That's actually the key to my book, my blurry book. It's coming in and out of focus. My blurry book says exactly this, which is that what we are owed is an apology, a reformulation. It's okay to make mistakes. I understand the panic. I'm not saying anybody in Brazil did anything wrong necessarily as it occurred, because people are people. They do people things. And the real problem is later on when you say, oh my God, Zika has never caused microcephaly again anywhere else. And you can't back up and say, they come up with 5 different theories about why this has happened, but none of the theories include, we could have been wrong at the beginning.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. I think people are very forgiving in those sorts of events. It's like, oops, we made a mistake. And that will make people trust you more because they know at least you're self-examining, and there's a sense of humility there as well. And that's kind of how I feel with all the COVID thing. If we were told, oops, we probably shouldn't have done that, but let's try this, I think everybody would have been on board. There would have been a lot less skepticism around it than there is and still remains.
Yeah,
and there's so much damage.
You're absolutely right. It comes down to standard fundamental principles. I mean, we're all humans, and we can all be excellent, we can all be miserable, and we can be cruel to each other, and we can be kind. I think a lot of it's like combing your hair. You can make it do one thing or another, and it depends whether you want to comb your hair at all. And people are not necessarily that much different, in the larger sense. And we have to, have the ability to be good to ourselves and good to each other.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, let me ask you kind of a different turn, but still talking about these diseases or whatnot. How much of informing the people do you believe is the job of the government as opposed to the CDC? Like how much responsibility should they really have? Presidential cabinets, Congress, people that are not a part of the medical field. As opposed to the CDC with the doctors.
That's a really fascinating question, and the answer to every question on Earth is it depends. So I'm going to throw that out there. It depends on the situation. I think in the micro sense, your best advice is from your own physician, and your family and friends and whatnot. One treatment could work for say 5 different people, and in your situation, you might not want to do the treatment. My 90-year-old mother was with us downstairs, and if she had developed, I don't know, a secondary problem while she was about to die, you wouldn't necessarily give the same treatment as you would for a 20-year-old. Sure. So, but as far as pronouncements on health, I think that the politicians actually might have a better handle on some aspects of this than the experts. So, I think Mr. Trump's kind of tragic flaw was kind of yielding the stage to the experts, and it became just doctor talk day after day, and you lose sight. They wanted to have basically zero COVID, and their place on earth is still pursuing the zero COVID policy. You may not. A lot of people don't keep up with what's going on day to day in China, but even just a couple months ago, they were locking down Shanghai, which is an enormous city. I think it's 3 times the size of New York City, at the very least. And they were trying to lock down the entire city and keep everyone in their own little apartments in these huge high-rises everywhere, because they wanted to have zero cases of COVID. Now, it's a nonsensical thing, because Omicron is not even related to original COVID. It's just a regular common cold coronavirus. We've always had those.
This was for Omicron?
Yeah, Omicron,
Shanghai?
exactly. It's a Greek letter.
Yeah.
And they actually skipped the letter XI, which is the Chinese premier, Kai. I mean, if they call him Xi, but, they purposely skipped that letter so as not to offend China. But in point of fact, they're trying to do an impossibility. I had a dream once. It was a recurring dream, but when I was a kid, I had this big cube of ice, and I was like a lion tamer. It was hot day, and I was trying to whip that ice into not melting. Okay, and I woke up from this dream, and I had it a few times. I woke up from this dream exhausted, because you can't keep ice from melting. Whip doesn't help. You can't yell at the ice. There's nothing you can do. Things happen. Cold viruses are going to happen. If you're going to have people, cold viruses are really, really good. They've been with us for, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of years. As long as humans have been around, cold viruses have been around. And you cannot whip the population to not having the common cold. And you can't, lock people down into not, so and it's just a crazy goal. And so at different times, we have had this kind of restriction of the huge lockdowns and the masks and all that kind of stuff. Those were brought out by the doctors. And then the politicians say, well, the doctor said it, so we do it. This is where the politicians would do better to have a filter. And this is where we have had some benefit by, I was mentioning, I got cut off the last time, by having 50 separate states in the union. So we've had experiments from state to state. So we can see, the emperor has no clothes, even as it's been presented to us. You have to do this. And so we've had the virtue as a country to have different kind of crucibles, experimental, areas where we can follow one thing or another. And across the board, we've seen this from state to state, internationally, and from country to country. across the globe. I mean, there's a very, I actually had my own little podcast tonight, and I brought up the case of Tanzania in Southeast Africa, which is a country of 60 million people, huge, and they've had basically no COVID at all. Now, part of that's probably they're probably not testing that much, but they also may not care that much, and it may not be that much of a difference. They don't have as old a population as Italy and Germany and whatnot demographically, but they have not been scarred by it. They're not. It's not like the plague came or even Ebola or anything like that.
Possibly not much international travel. Could that be
well, there's
part
that.
of it?
There's also they also have ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine over the counter.
Oh wow!
And so it's a number of different things. They might we had this proscription, which means not a prescription, but we had basically a mandate against having treatment for COVID-19, which is silliness. I mean, in the year 2020, when there was no vaccine, we didn't know when the vaccine would be produced, if ever. There was no reason not to be able to try certain medications. I'm not endorsing HCQ, and I'm not endorsing ivermectin. I don't know fully whether they work. I think ivermectin has a slightly greater chance of working, and some of the studies are showing positively. So, but be that as it may, there's no reason, if you don't have anything else, to try these things which have been generic and harmless and approved for other reasons to try it. I mean, I wouldn't tell people to take rat poison, but if you had a dose of penicillin, loads and loads of people taking penicillin when they have a cold. There's no real reason for it, but they don't, no harm, no foul. They don't die.
Gotcha. And what for the next pandemic that comes up, and I guess there's another one on the way, we just don't know when. What do you suggest that regular people do? Folks like me, if you're talking to somebody like me who's not in the medical community, just Jane Public,
right.
What would you say? What would you suggest?
Well, I think most of these things, it's a tough one. I can't practice medicine over the phone or the internet, so I'm not going to give any specific person medical advice. I mean, obviously, you're going to talk to your own doctor and so forth. But I think we have been taught that things get exaggerated for political effect, oftentimes.
Yes.
I think Zika was one, and there were a lot of people in Latin America who wanted ZPG, zero population growth. They wanted abortion to be legal. And those are Catholic countries. Abortion is not legal in Brazil. It's not legal in Colombia. And there were a lot of people who grabbed onto a virus in order to get a political goal. So there's a lot of political football always being played. You have to be aware of it. That's not to say there can't be some plague coming down the pike, but it's not that likely, and so forth. I mean, I don't want to be proved wrong, but for the most part, the exaggerations have been in one direction. They've always been exaggerating too much danger when it doesn't happen. I don't know how many times, if you know Lucy and the football, Charlie Brown.
Yeah.
I mean, she pulls that football away every time, and Charlie Brown goes to kick it every time. I mean, how many times have you heard about the great Ebola, a pandemic that's going to come hit our turf? We test for Ebola. This is it's sort of like messaging malpractice to talk about Ebola pandemics, because Ebola is a virus. It's a real thing, and nobody here wants to get it. But when it happens, it's like an explosion. It's like 9/11. It's a big boom, a big hole in the ground, and a horrible thing. But people react. They act differently after 9/11. They act differently when Ebola occurs. They stay away, and they make quarantines. They treat people differently, and it never spreads because it's so damaging. I'm not going to call it Bock's law, but basically there's kind of a balance as far as viruses and infectious agents go. That if they want to really kill you, they can do that, but then they don't spread a lot. Because like a meteor or something, they crash down and they've kind of made a big crater, and everyone else is like, whoa, get away. And humans we're not viruses, but we react in a population sense against threats. And so if a virus wants to be successful and get to a lot of, it has a choice. It can either be really deadly for a few people, or it could be really mild for a lot of people.
Gotcha.
And so the iterations, the various generations that occur from coronavirus, from SARS-CoV-2 to the current version, not even related, but is basically to get milder over time. So if it wants to be more transmissible, it has to be milder. They keep every variant that's come out, the press through the CDC, whatever, say this is the most virulent strain ever. This is the most transmissible strain. Well, that's actually a good thing because that means it's not killing people.
And to make a comment also about what Inger said with the next pandemic that comes, I think that in a way, the pandemic 2020, 2021, it's been kind of a training and a drill so that if the people that live through this, if something else comes in our lifetimes, we're not going to be as caught off guard or scared or shocked.
Maybe.
Yeah.
And
from a health standpoint, do you mean from a health standpoint, from a political standpoint?
No, from health and just with what to do, how to react, and I mean the panic, the people going to the stores buying toilet paper and ramen noodles.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure we're trainable in that regard. I think humans will do exactly the same thing for whatever the next panic is. I think that is that's kind of on our our more primitive brain. I don't think there's really any way around that. The real question is whether we have better political leaders and more thoughtful ones. What
do you think are the chances that if we see another pandemic in our lifetimes, and we're in our 50s, we're the same generation. If we see another pandemic, that it would be spreading as fast or killing at as high a rate as COVID-19.
I think the rate. See, I mentioned I'm a skeptical person. I don't think coronavirus ever killed at that higher rate. The overall survival rate for coronavirus is 99.97. I recommend. I think people. This was easily accessible at the time. I don't know if you've heard of the Diamond Princess, but this is a boat that was off the shore of Japan in January 2020,
right?
And there were 3,711 people on the boat. And it skewed elderly because that's the people who can afford to be on the cruise ship. But it had a lot of young crew members, and there were some kids and so forth. Anyway, the coronavirus stayed on that boat, and the boat, nobody let the Japanese authorities would not let the boat land. Right. So it was like this ship of fools. It was out there on the water by itself for a month or whatever. And so they had a full COVID-19 experiment already completed. If you ever wanted to do that experiment and you didn't have like these unwilling volunteers, if you could, it would cost you, I don't know, $100 billion to get all the same number of people on the boat and give them coronavirus. But they had this perfect experiment, and at the end of the day, the mortality was minimal, and the population again, like it was older than our average population. So there were a lot of 80-year-olds and whatnot. As a total of 10 people died from the 3,711.
What?
Yeah, well, you can look it up. It's a Diamond Princess. I recommend everyone just spend a little time. It's probably got a Wikipedia page. There were very, very few actual cases of coronavirus, even though they have air. This big metal thing and the air is recirculating. A lot of people don't even have windows, so any air they get is from somebody else. And they didn't have a filtration system that was developed for COVID. They just got a regular old cruise ship, and they're having mass meals before everyone knew what it was. They had all the time in the world to get this thing through everybody. But I think only 1 out of 6 people actually had symptoms. Half the people who turned positive testing later on didn't even know they had it. The young people as a whole, didn't even know anything. They had no cases at all, no illnesses, no cases, no deaths. And so the median age of death was 82 years old. And so that means that half the people were over 82 and half the people were under. The 5 were, 4 or 5 were over. And so this is exactly what got duplicated throughout the entire pandemic. A very, very low death rate, skews elderly, young people have no symptoms. And so this to have called it a pandemic when that information was available in January 2020 is malfeasant. And I think it's an exaggeration. And again, people do things because people do things, but not all of them are correct. And so, you have to be careful. And I don't know how, you can go back to base sources, but the people who talked about the Diamond Princess are the people you should probably listen to next time. And the people who never brought it up, probably people you should not listen to. But I it's a hard thing. I don't know when the next one is, if at all. But a lot of these things are brought about for their own purposes, because that's how people who have power like power, and it's a very useful controlling device.
Yes.
Let me ask you this, a similar thing for my last question to you. With the case of the cruise ship that was off the coast of California in the Pacific, and they were on a ship and not allowed to come in ashore. And Gavin Newsom floated a bunch of test kits out to them and said, this we're keeping our distance. We're sending you this for now. And I guess send the test kits back and we'll see what the results are. I mean, that's similar to what they did in Japan minus the test kits. So was he correct in how he handled that, you think?
I'd have to look up to see when that happened and what it was involved. But
okay.
It's probably no. I imagine it was overkill and probably showmanship, because there was a lot of coronavirus. There always would have been amongst the general population. It's not as if it was the only case of plague or something like that on Earth. Yeah. So there were many others. There's a lot of leakage. And at the time, there's probably an open border with Mexico. They're not testing people as they come across the border.
Absolutely.
So you're testing people on a cruise ship, but you're not going to close the border at Tijuana. I mean, I don't think a lot of this always makes sense. He gave a lot of measures that people should stay at home. They should not congregate. Blah, blah, while he was at scene and filmed at parties and whatnot. And more recently, he's told everybody to turn off the AC. And he it was a hot day where he was, and he's wearing a fleece sweater, which can only mean he's in the air-conditioned room.
Right.
And so, I think politicians say things, but a lot of what happens politically is, means of control. A fearful population is much easier to control.
Yes.
And I mentioned The Emperor's New Clothes, which is Hans Christian Andersen, fairy tale. But The Wizard of Oz is the same thing. The actual man behind the green curtain is not that big. He's not a real wizard. And a lot of the pronouncements are not any more, refined or well-defined than, from your own physician or whatever. But the person is in power. And the person might be in power for reasons completely different from medical expertise.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, I appreciate that. And I guess my last question is, what are your social handles? And also tell us again the title of your book.
Yep. Well, hopefully it's not blurry when you see it. I got to get this blur filter off my Skype, which I can apologize. I don't use that much. Okay. But off and on you can see it's Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was by Randall Bock, MD. It's on Amazon. My social media, I'm on Twitter at Dr. Randall Bock. That's Dr. Okay. And then you can see my name in the corner there. Just spell it out. You got to spell it out right without the S. Dr. Randall Bock on Twitter. But if you put probably my last name and Zika, you'll find me. I'm on Facebook. I make most of my posts public because why not? I mean, if they're going to want to find stuff out about you, they're going to find stuff out about you.
Exactly.
And so I have a YouTube and whatnot. But let's say I'll just do the Facebook ones. I have a few Facebook pages. I've got Viral Conversation, and I've got Overturning Zika. And that's good enough to start.
All righty. Good deal. We'll make sure that we let everyone know and that we post it out in the description. Right.
Yeah, so the most important one for me is to go to Amazon, buy the book, leave a review, and hopefully it's a good review.
Yes, I looked at it, and there were 5 5-star reviews. So,
yeah.
Yes.
When the haters get to it, that'll change.
Yeah.
Because there is a narrative. I mean, there are people who, don't want to have their pandemics threatened.
Right.
And even when it's disappeared. So we'll see about that.
And you're over the target when you get a lot of opposition.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, this has been delightful. I'm very much in your debt.
Thank you, Dr. Bock. And everybody, thank you for checking out this episode of Brutally Honest Talk Radio. Keep coming back. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, videos on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and iHeartRadio. And this is a weekly show. We'll check you on the next one. Everybody stay safe. We'll catch you later.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Brutally Honest Talk Radio. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover, reach out at bruthonest@gmail.com. That's BRUT, honestradio@gmail.com.